An attorney with the animal rights group Animal Justice recently debated a dairy farmer who said lots and lots of very silly things on Canadian TV. Let's take a look.
Last week, we had a discussion about the policing powers of the Ontario SPCA. It got quite a reaction, especially on social media, where the conversation took on a life of its own. Specifically, comments made by one of the guests about livestock got people talking. So we thought it was worth having a follow-up conversation. Joining us now for that, in the nation's capital, Camille Labchuk, lawyer and executive director for the animal rights group Animal Justice. And here in our studio, Bonnie Den Haan, dairy farmer who runs Haanview Farms. She's also a board member of Dairy Farmers of Ontario. And Bonnie, it's good to have you on the program for the first time. Yes. Camille, welcome back.
Good to be here.
Yeah, you got all this started. We should say, why should we say it? Why don't we let you have the word on this? Here's what you had to say when you were last on this program not too long ago. Sheldon, if you would.
There's the issue of enforcement in the first place. Right now, enforcement of laws on farms is complaint-based. That's because we don't have proactive inspections. And the reason we don't have proactive, regular inspections of farms is because there are no laws. There's no standards, no regulations governing the lives of animals on farms from the minute that they're born to the day that they're shipped for transport.
Okay, that provoked quite a firestorm on Twitter. And here are some of the tweets that followed. Camille, you followed up with, there are no regulations or laws setting out animal welfare standards for farms. The industry makes up its own rules. To which we got some response. Here's Catherine Agar. I love the agenda. It is known for balance and insightful discussion. However, this episode was a huge miss, and I'm questioning the vetting process for guests. S. Pakin, you need to make this right. Catherine Underwood followed up. You honestly think the general public knows what's best for animals? The separation between rural and urban populations is growing. Caring for your pet is different than caring for cows, chickens, or pigs. The general public has no idea what a cow needs for a healthy lifestyle.
All right, yeah, so let's pause it right there. So the general public, you honestly think the general public knows what's best for animals? Well, as if a industry built on profiting off of animals would be a better source of knowing what's good for animals. As if this industry, which is deliberately, treating animals as a commodity, that's clearly where we need to go. That's clearly going to know what's best for animals, more than opening up the conversation to a broader dialogue. The general public has no idea what a cow needs for a healthy lifestyle. If we actually had a conversation that was coming from that perspective rather than a healthy bottom line for the farm, we're approaching this whole conversation from the wrong place right from the get-go.
And then came Tessa. Codes of practice are not laws, but they are highly enforced, and the programs have the ability to shut down the farm. You said there are no regulations, standards, or laws, yet there are all three. Pet owners only have to abide by abuse laws, but farms are held to higher standards.
Now, a point of clarification there, which is going to be brought out in this debate, just to be clear, that Ms. Labchuk, she said that there are no regulations for the lives of the animals, so from when they're born until they're sent to slaughter. And as she'll clarify later, but I just want to draw it out right now, is that the regulations that exist that are applicable, and this is Ontario, Canada, are for the transport and slaughter process. So that was accurate.
And then Bernie Kamphoff came in. Hey, Camille, thanks for being honest with us, finally, and letting your true colors show. If you wanted all animal agriculture to cease to exist, why didn't you just say so earlier? Okay, that is only a minor fraction of some of the feedback that we got on social media. So, Camille, why don't we start with you and have you just sort of amplify on your original thought.
And actually, maybe we should just pause for a moment on that of animal agriculture ceasing to exist. So I think in various formats it makes sense. How do you want to frame the conversation? Do you want to talk about animal welfare? Do you want to talk about regulations? What medium are you talking about? Or, in what spaces are you talking about? What sort of objectives? And so, if people think that's deceptive or something like that, then we can have that conversation. But in the very immediate term, it's really a dodge from what we're going to get into here, from the lack of transparency and from the conditions that are actually existing on farms and how that truth is being suppressed.
And to add to that, it's really about those regulations and then who are actually enforcing those regulations. And, when this debate unfolds, we'll get to see exactly who those folks are, and it's just not who you think.
That's that prompted so much response. the notion that there are no laws governing the care of farm animals. Follow up, if you would.
Well, I think the general public doesn't really understand that there aren't laws protecting animal welfare on farms. So there aren't proactive standards that set out things like space requirements, for instance. The only laws that do apply are general animal cruelty laws, which kick in after egregious cases of abuse, for sure. But I was surprised by the reaction from farmers because it seemed like many of them didn't understand either that there are no proactive animal welfare regulations on farms. The laws that we do have kick in when animals are transported to the slaughterhouse and when they are slaughtered themselves. But from when they're born until they're transported, there is no comprehensive legal standards and regulations for how they should be treated. And I think that that's inappropriate in this modern age.
Bonnie, what's your response to that?
Actually, there's 3 layers of regulations and rules on the farm. And the first one is the OSPCA, and they have the authority to enter and inspect and actually seize the animals if they fear that the animals are in harm. Then they can lay charges, and once charges are laid, or even when the OSPCA comes in for an inspection, there's an MOU with the Dairy Farmers of Ontario and just about every other farm animal commodity group to call them in for the inspection as well, just because they have the expertise on what the animals' care should be and how they should look.
You said there's 3 layers, so that's one?
Yes, that's one layer, and if there are charges, it goes under the Criminal Code of Canada. That's the second layer, that's federal. And the third layer is Dairy Farmers of Ontario have a Pro-Action program, which is a quality assurance. And that's exactly as you mentioned. They have space requirements, water requirements, water spacing, feeding requirements, and bedding, and they have all these requirements that you have to meet. And OSPCA, they're not widespread across Ontario. There's lots of pockets of Ontario that OSPCA is not available to. And yet we have Dairy Farmers of Ontario have field service staff that enter the farms every 2 years unannounced. And
unannounced meaning
unannounced,
no heads up
that they're coming.
All right, so much with that. So she says, well, there's 3 layers. Now, the first layer consists of the OSPCA, and in a moment here, we're going to get to what OSPCA enforcement exists. And then it's like, well, within the criminal code, once it's brought up to the criminal code, then they can bring some sort of action. And then best of all, the dairy farmers themselves, who are again, people entrenched in the industry get to. I mean, that's just like me saying, well, how do I enforce my? I mean, I do it myself, so I think I'm awesome. I think I'm the shit. So I'm good. Like that's one layer of enforcement. And then like I asked my cat, like licked himself, and like that seemed pretty legit. And then like I have a Michael Jordan poster up on the wall, and he's like looking at me and like giving me a thumbs up. So that's like 3 layers. I mean, that's 3 layers of like I'm like the best person ever.
And then she goes back within that same statement and says the OSPCA is also just like not widespread, so like it's not even like she said that it was a layer, and then she was just like, well, they don't actually, like they're not there and available, so it just kind of undermines her own point there.
Yeah, and now if you were to do a little bit of digging, which I can show you here momentarily, is that the OSPCA, if you look kind of through their records, there's a decent record of enforcement when it comes to basically any animal abuse that doesn't include profit. So dogs and cats, this kind of thing. There's a decent amount of enforcement out there in the news. You just kind of look around, you see it. But I want to show something within farming, and because this is Ontario, Canada, where this is happening. And if folks don't want to see animal cruelty, you might want to click away. I'm just going to show you some things really quickly to show you the kind of animal abuse that's happening in Canada, in Ontario, right where this debate is filmed. So this is a dare pork. This is a pig farm in Lucan, Ontario, and that's a prolapse. It's actually a veterinarian looked at that, and it's actually not even clear whether that's vaginal or rectal or both. So pretty disgusting, and this, what I'm showing you, was reported to the OSPCA, similar findings on a recurring basis. So here are pigs in gestation crates. This is industry standard. So certainly industry standards are not something that they're going to feel compelled to take any sort of action on, and they don't. Gestation crates, once again, these are where pigs are living for the duration of a pregnancy in these stalls, barely large enough for them to turn around.
You go back to that picture and you can just go back to, right here, you can see that there's literally no space for anyone to turn around at all. Like, I didn't even realize how, that's just...
And, and here you have, this is a mother pig in a gestation crate, and you can see the dead piglets there, that's like the next stall over. Similarly, mother in a gestation crate, the piglets there. That's really horrible. So there you see many piglets, and this is really just the cost of doing business. They have a certain acceptable rate of piglet mortality, and this is absolutely just cooked into the business model, and something the OSPCA is not going to enforce. And there you go. All right, we're going to click off of that. So all those findings. So if you clicked away, the animal cruelty stuff is gone. But suffice it to say, horrific cruelty in an Ontario pig farm, and similar conditions to that have been reported to the authorities multiple times. Reported to the OSPCA. And we did get some enforcement action on this one. So let's take a look at what that enforcement action looked like. So this is an article from the Star. It's a national newspaper in Toronto. This is Jenny Mcqueen. She's the investigator who went into this pig farm on multiple occasions and again reported her findings to the OSPCA. If folks want to look this up, there's the title on the front lines of animal welfare. The Star. You should be able to find that. And you can kind of read all about it, and let's just get right down to where it talks about the cruelty that she found in this Ontario pig farm. And here it says, in March, after another clandestine visit to a dare, again this is a dare pork, she made a second appeal to the OSPCA. So after she'd done it previously, with it, she included a photo of a sow suffering from a prolapsed uterus. Again, she says she heard nothing back, and I can verify this. I've been entrenched in this process and been in conversation with Jenny, including the legal representation, which is the next thing we'll get to, because when she reported her findings, there was, as I said, there was a legal response, but it sure wasn't against the farm. And what actually happened was... as it says here, in August, this is August last year, 2018, Mcqueen showed up at 5 a.m. at the farm ready for more open rescue. But this time, excuse me, I'm slightly out of order here. So this was another time they visited the farm to document what was going on. There were workers there, so they weren't able to document on that day. But then, October 4th of last year, police, armed with a search warrant, raided her Toronto home. She was handcuffed and charged with break and enter, as well as mischief to property worth more than $5,000. She is due to appear in court later this month. This was last year. Her case is ongoing. As she says there, they treated me like a terrorist. All we were trying to do is save the animal. So here, once again, we have Jenny Mcqueen. This is a 54-year-old retired government employee. No prior record of any, no prior criminal history, who's going into this farm. She rescued this piglet out, and just documenting this again, I won't pull the footage up again, but the horrible conditions at this farm. And OSPCA has nothing at all to say about it, no enforcement action whatsoever, and now Jenny is facing these very serious charges. In America, this is the equivalent of felony charges for exposing what's really going on. So that's your OSPCA for you. All right, let's jump back to the conversation here. We'll continue that.
95% of the Ontario dairy farms have been visited in the last 2 years.
Okay, let's get Camille's feedback on that. Go ahead, Camille.
Okay, well, we're talking about, Bonnie, you mentioned the OSPCA Act and OSPCA inspectors. The OSPCA Act has general prohibitions against abusing animals, so those only kick in after an egregious case of abuse. It's not like they set out standards for the well-being of farmed animals. And in fact...
Okay, so what she's saying there is that the enforcement actions happen when an egregious case is reported, if they even decide to do anything about it. So the type of thing that you just saw in those photographs isn't explicitly prohibited. There'd be no enforcement on it on the front end. And then even after it is, obviously we've just seen the inaction that happens even when you do report it. So you can throw out as many layers, invent as many organizations and as many farmer cooperatives and as many whatever layers of whatever. But the bottom line is what actual enforcement action is happening. And so you just see like at every level there's just nothing really happening here other than a bunch of fluff.
There's explicit exemptions in the OSPCA Act that exempt generally accepted farming practices from those cruelty provisions. So that's
like
certainly not
Gestation
anywhere
Crates,
near sufficient to ensure animal welfare. And then the Pro-Action program that you bring up, of course, is an industry self-assessment tool. It's not a law. It's something created for farmers by the farm industry. 14 out of 15 voting members that created that are dairy farmers themselves. And I don't trust the industry to police itself. It is literally the fox guarding the hen house. I don't think that inspections every 2 years are something that's sufficient to ensure the well-being of animals on farms. And the practices that code of practice and that the Pro-Action program allows for are still, frankly, egregious. Things like separating baby calves from their mothers within moments of birth. A lot of people don't appreciate that to produce milk, you have to constantly impregnate cows because they only produce milk when they're lactating after giving birth. So mothers and babies are separated. And when cows and their bodies give out after years of milk production, it's only a couple of years actually when their productivity starts to decline, they're sent to slaughterhouses to become hamburger meat. So even the standards that do exist by the industry's own standards are simply not sufficient. We need strong government laws and government inspections.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. How about the fox guarding the hen house type of thing?
Yes, be careful who you're calling the fox. The Dairy Farmers Pro-Action program is built on the Code of Practices and Best Management Practices. And I don't know if you're familiar with the National Farm Animal Care Council. They're made up of processors, producers, researchers, retailers, vets.
All right, so it's not just farmers. Trust me, this isn't just a bunch of farmers saying farmers are great. We have a whole host of people paid by the industry, the processors, the farmers, the retailers, the researchers. See, it's everybody who's getting paid by the farmers think the farmers are the shit. This is awesome. I mean, it's like, is this actually a point? Oh, man. Yeah, Steph, you have thoughts on that?
I mean, what I think this is just collusion. I mean, like, they are all vested and they have lots of dollars that, they otherwise, like, their livelihoods depend on this money, and their livelihoods depend on just not seeing this, like, overt animal abuse.
And also, what's interesting too is like her specific focus on the dairy industry, because it's in relative terms. We look at like what's happening to chickens. What I just showed you that's happening to pigs. It's like a very it's kind of the most friendly framing you can come up with. And we'll see in a moment here. She talks about, oh, people just drop into my farm. I'm so happy to show them. It's like, well, you're not showing them what happens when cows are first born, when they're taken away. You're not showing them what happens at the slaughterhouse, obviously. And so you're showing them this specific industry where it's actually a tiny percentage of the individuals. A dairy farm might have a few hundred animals, a few hundred individuals. A chicken factory farm is going to have tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. So you're talking about a tiny percentage of the individuals being used, and you're generalizing that to the entire industry. And you're actually just talking about a part of the process, and you're saying, hey, this might represent us well, and it does represent you better than walking into a factory chicken farm. But it's really this cherry-picked, selective little framing is pretty telling.
Government agencies and the World Animal Protection Organization even has some input into that. And that's what Pro-Action is built on. It's not built on the whim of 15 dairy farmers self-governing themselves. This is based on science.
Bonnie, do you know if there are animal cruelty
So she just threw out the word science to just talk about all of these different people that are involved in this like systemic cruelty. And I mean, obviously, like when people throw out the word science, I think that people, back away and they're like, oh, there's reasoning and rationale that goes into something. But there's no science here. There's just people who are interested in making money and just ignoring so much.
And to the extent that there is science, I mean, you look at the the science that is involved with like something. If you go to school for animal, ag science or something like that, well, it's geared towards, okay, what's the science of like breeding an animal for maximum profit? How would we breed a cow to produce the most milk? What's like the cycling off of, how many piglets do we kill? What percentage is the right percentage to kill if they're above a certain weight, if they're below a certain weight? So, to the extent that science is being applied, it's just, you're just throwing around all these fluffy words of all these, enforcement and, regulation and science, and just like, don't look at the details, don't look at the pictures, don't listen to the activists, just, we got you covered here.
Problems on farms in the province of Ontario.
There's bad teachers, there's bad lawyers, there's bad doctors, and certainly there's probably bad farmers. But the system doesn't allow them to exist. So
and it's just it is a fundamental distinction of like, if you just like bow your head and worship whatever the law, which was written by industry, happens to say, versus common sense. You look at gestation crates,
it defies logic. And what she's going to say next is really just like, she's just going on this like, there's bad, teachers, there's bad lawyers, all of these like other areas, like other fields and industries have governance in a meaningful way so that we do have protections in place for people. So this is also just a bad excuse for not having regulations that should be in place.
If there's a bad farmer out there, our system is in place that we can identify those farms and identify the problems, and we can shut them down. Like we won't pick up their milk. No one wants to drink milk from an abused cow.
No one wants to drink milk from an abused cow. I agree with you there. But is the solution to expose the abuse, or to just make people think the abuse isn't happening? That's a little difference in perspective. Like,
and also like no one wants to drink the milk of an abused cow. How is that like even determined? The milk at the end of the day is the same end product, and you miss all of that because of these like 2-year inspections. There's so much that's missed in that process that we don't know what that abuse looks like because we don't have any visibility.
If there is a sign of abuse on the farm, it is canceled, and that more or less shuts that farm down because they can't pay their bills.
Camille, even if the kinds of regulations, legal, with teeth, that you say are not in place, even if in the absence of those regulations, do you have evidence that there is in fact abuse going on farms in the province?
Well, absolutely. We know that there is serious animal welfare problems on farms. So Dairy Farmers of Ontario, it doesn't release its assessment reports. It doesn't release numbers, to my knowledge, on any times farms have been shut down or their milk has not been picked up. We don't know anything about that process, but we do know a little bit about the British Columbia system because some Freedom of Information requests revealed this information. When they implemented a very similar self-assessment process in 2014, over a quarter of farms were found to be out of compliance, even with the industry's own very, very weak rules. And these were things like severely overcrowding cows, not providing enough bedding, having herds where many cows were lame or had very serious leg or knee injuries, and those things are simply not acceptable.
Okay,
so we need transparency in Ontario.
Sure, if it's that way in British Columbia, you're sort of inferring that we probably have.
It's just not on my farm. So because it's not on my farm doesn't mean it's not happening. So obviously I'm the corner case, or I'm the case that represents all farms because.
Yeah, and we'll hear that momentarily. Or we heard a little bit of that from the farmer here. And it's really something because the people that volunteer to come onto here, these tend to be, like you said, the folks who feel like they're kind of above the standard, and it's like, well, that doesn't defeat the fact of they're better than average. That doesn't change the fact of like what the rule is and what the mass systemic cruelty is, and when you see this really, really horrible dynamic whereby all these people who tend to be upper middle classish who tend to be white skinned want to tell you about how wonderful their farm is, and then what their kind of like the implicit denigration is towards like the worst of the factory farm settings, which tend to be people who don't have a lot of opportunity, a lot of undocumented labor, and they're providing the food to the poorest of the poor. So it's like all these, wealthy, well-to-do people are just saying, oh, look at me, I'm up here, I'm all good, so let's just scoff at whatever else is out there, whatever else is happening. Like, of course, they're not going to say these things overtly, but it is, just a really problematic dynamic that's just kind of like just under the surface.
A similar problem in similar proportions in the province of Ontario, but that's not proof. Do you have proof?
Well, there's no way for citizens.
Do you have proof? We have proof. I won't pull the images up again, but yeah, proof doesn't do it.
To obtain that evidence, Steve, and that's part of the problem. If we had a strong government inspection system, what we would have is laws and standards that set out how animals must be treated, and we'd have inspectors who go onto those farms and produce public reports that the public can access.
This is like such basic, just ridiculously common sense stuff. Ordinary people would just assume, of course this is happening. Of course animal welfare standards, of course there are people going onto farms and doing inspections and producing public reports. How could that not be the case? Ordinary people would just assume that this is already happening. And here, it's treated as though she's, arguing for some extreme, so just some extreme makeover of the system.
So the areas where we do regulate animals, transport and slaughter, I can actually get those inspection reports so I know if a slaughterhouse has a problem. But I can't do that for farms, and I don't think that's appropriate.
Bonnie, do you have a transparency problem?
Farm animals are not behind closed doors.
Question to ask her.
We have open houses constantly. There's breakfast on the farm is offered twice a year throughout Ontario.
Again, you and your one little bougie farm, and you and your, little snippet, just the dairy industry, not when they're born, not when they're slaughtered, just like this little perfect little segment, which represents 0.0001% of animals for part of their life frame. Breakfast on the farm with Bonnie.
Christmas on the farm is offered down by Ancaster. There are numerous days on the farm. Dinner on the farm down in Niagara. There's so many opportunities for you to get out and find out what dairy farming is all about. You've painted a very bleak picture there, but it's not like that on the farm. I live and breathe this every day. I love my animals. There's nothing more content than to go to the barn in the morning and see your cows lying on sand bedding, very clean, calves being born on a nice straw pack in a great environment. There's nothing more satisfying than that. And you've painted a very bleak picture of the dairy industry, and it's not like that at all.
Let me read a tweet here from Joanna Wallace, again, one of the many, I don't know if it was hundreds, but it was certainly dozens of tweets that we got in reaction to this. Here's Joanna Wallace. In addition to the Dairy Farmers of Ontario regulations we must adhere to, most dairy and other livestock farms have regular vet visits. In our case, a vet walks through our herd
All right, now I want to address that very specifically. So veterinarians, as it applies to farm animals raised for profit, is very different from veterinarians as it applies to your dog or your cat. If your dog or cat gets sick, in most cases, you're very willing to spend hundreds, thousands of dollars to save the life of that animal. Obviously, for a farmer to do it, to make money off of this, that's not going to be the case. All right, so veterinarians understand that. They understand that dynamic. I've been to veterinarians when we've taken chickens in, and their first thing is, and you really have to drill this into their head, it's just instantly, any sort of a problem, euthanize. Instantly, because this chicken is like, why did you even schedule a visit? I'm confused, because by the time that you scheduled the appointment, you've walked in the door, it's already 5 times, the value of that chicken. So it's just very much coming from a different place. And to say there's veterinary visits, there's an ocean of difference between, the well-being necessary for an animal to make you a profit and the well-being of an animal for an animal to actually live a life worth living.
every 2 weeks. Animal welfare is paramount. Camille, is that helpful?
No, I think if dairy farmers and other industries too are so proud of these inspections, they should make those reports public, and they should advocate for the government to actually impose laws on their industry. If there's nothing to hide, then there's nothing to hide. But the reality is that animals are kept behind closed doors on farms. Maybe dairy farms sometimes have very controlled open houses. But I want to know what Bonnie thinks about chicken warehouses where chickens are stacked on top of each other in tiny wire battery cages, thousands of them in there. Pig barns where pigs are kept in tiny crates while they're giving birth and while they're feeding their babies in filthy conditions. I don't think that's something the public has access to. And the government should be overseeing those conditions. Right now, they're not.
Well, Bonnie's not a chicken farmer, but if you want to comment on that.
Many of my friends are chicken farmers, and they care for their animals just as much as I do for mine. And when you talk about pigs giving birth in small crates, I really think you need to get out to the farm and visit some farms. And if you go out of, if you make an effort to come out and see a chicken farm and a pig farm and walk in the door, you will be allowed to walk in the door and find it. I think the pictures that you're drawing are sort of imaginary. They're not really what's happening on the farm. And I said we had 3 levels of inspection. We actually have 4. Because we have the vet, we have the feed salesman, we have the seed salesman, we have the neighbors.
All right, so we got the people entrenched in the industry, and I think that's
we have our grandchildren.
Grandchildren. What do you think about Grandma's farm? What does little Johnny think about Bougie Bonnie's Dairy Fantasyland? So it's literally, these are her layers of inspection, are people who are paid by the industry, the feed salesman, and I forget, other people in the industry. And then like your neighbors and your grandchildren, like she literally actually said the words her grandchildren. That's your enforcement.
Like we live in our barn, we eat breakfast in our barn every morning. So it's if someone drives up the lane and wants to come and talk to us, they're going to have to come to our barn. And when we're in our barn, they're looking at our cows.
Okay, so, but if somebody's trying to sell you feed, they're not likely to blow the whistle on you, are they?
Certainly they are. That's part of their responsibility. And a veterinarian, when they become a veterinarian, they sign on that they are going to look out for...
Says it on a paper. Come on now. Papers, come on.
Animal welfare issues.
Camille, people are going to want me to ask you, when's the last time you were on a farm?
Well, I grew up in rural PEI.
I just want to back that up. She just asserts that it's true, but there's not an actual defense of why is it true? Does the feed salesman... Because that guy is actually hitting her with the point. Wait a second, a feed salesman wants to sell you feed.
Part of their responsibility. And when we're in our barn, they're looking at our cows.
Okay, but if somebody's trying to sell you feed, they're not likely to blow the whistle on you, are they?
Certainly they are. That's part of their responsibility. And a veterinarian, when they become a veterinarian, they sign on that they are going to look out for animal welfare issues.
Camille, people are going to want me to ask you, when's the last time you were on a farm?
Well, I grew up in rural PEI, and I've been on many farms in my life. It was part of where I'm from and part of my heritage. The reality is that farmers don't want people on their farms these days. The only way that the public has to effectively oversee what's happening is undercover investigations where someone gets a job on a farm, works there, and is then able to observe consistently day after day, week after week, the conditions. And what we've seen from those investigations is very troubling. There's only been one of a dairy farm that was in Chilliwack, British Columbia. There were 9 convictions stemming from that investigation for workers who beat cows with metal rods and pipes, who strung cows up with chains around their neck on forklifts, and who left cows with open festering wounds. Investigations in Ontario of chicken farms have revealed chicken stuff.
Animal abuse, that's what she's calling out here. And then, the point of this is really just we want to see the transparency, and we want to see it through the whole end-to-end life cycle of an animal. So just not in these just cases of abuse, which have to be
And another point of that too is just there actually is, I think, some limitations that people should be aware of too with these traditional undercover investigations, which I think it's very good that they exist, but there's a limitation when, as Camille describes, that these workers go on there and they'll hide a camera, they'll have an undercover camera, and they'll document what's happening there. And then she describes these convictions of these individual workers. And I think it's good that the public becomes aware of that, but I think it's more useful to highlight the systemic cruelty, because unfortunately what can happen in some of those instances, well, again, I think it's good that it's exposed, but it allows the industry to hide the systemic issues, and they say, oh man, this individual did something horrible, like beating a cow with a rod, as she explains, and then, these companies can come forward and really, come out looking golden out of the deal. They're like, thank you, animal rights activists, for exposing this horrific cruelty, and we fired this guy because we're not going to stand for cruelty on our farms. And it totally glosses over the fact of, the images that we show here, like the gestation crate use, battery cages where animals are living, in the dairy industry, on and on and on. The cruelty is systemic, and then we have these also one-off cases, and it's really important that that message gets encapsulated, and that's actually why something like open rescue investigations, as opposed to these undercover investigations where you're working there, open rescue investigators come there in the middle of the night, and they can really give, they're not trying to hide, they're not trying to be sneaky about it because they're already inside, there's no one else around. They can just really give you a picture, full 360-degree virtual reality in some cases with direct action everywhere, and just really give you the full systemic issue. And we're not demonizing these individuals. And once again, people don't want to work in these conditions. So these are, people who don't have a lot of options. They're often undocumented. And so, again, the industry, just like the dirtiest, grossest, stuff imaginable, the industry goes out there and scapegoating, so some of these individuals who didn't want this job, and often it's because they're so poor, the violence towards animals they're experiencing is this just psychologically harrowing experience, and then violence begets more violence, and we hands off and blame them.
In battery egg cages, dead and dying, missing all of their feathers, and sometimes stuck in manure pits below the cages. So I don't believe that this is something that the farming industry wants to see, and I don't think that this model of the fox guarding the hen house is working. Okay,
Bonnie, just let's, for the record, say any of those things. Do you do any of those things to your cows?
No, none of them.
Oh,
Tell me about
it's not, you haven't mentioned a case in Ontario, and there hasn't been assault like that or animal welfare issues like that in Ontario.
Where's Handview Farms?
Just by Alliston.
About an hour north of here.
About an hour north
We're
of
a
here.
How many
family
cows you got?
farm.
We milk 70 cows.
70 cows. All right. So again, 70 individuals, and factory chicken farms, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. So, to the extent that what she's saying about the lives, that these cows are living these good lives, it's just infinitesimally small, and it's just extremely dishonest that she's on here and she's defending the whole of animal agriculture based upon the supposed, humane treatment of 70 individuals.
A voluntary milking system, sand bed.
And that voluntary milking system, it really is, you talk about a voluntary system. So what she's saying is that, yes, these cows voluntarily come to be milked, and you're totally missing it if you are neglecting the part where for generations, for thousands of years, humans took animals non-voluntarily out of the wild. We bred them for our purposes non-voluntarily, and yes, we arrived at a point where these animals are dependent on us, where these animals they get extremely uncomfortable, and yes, they voluntarily will come to be milked. But this whole process, nothing about this is voluntarily, up until we set up this dependent system. If I take out a gun and I point it to your head and I say, I'm not telling you what to do, I'm just saying, if you don't give me $1,000, I'm going to shoot you. But it's totally up to you whether you do it. I'm just saying I'm going to shoot you. That's not actually voluntary. You've set up a whole arrangement that's here to serve you, that individual's well-being is very much in the balance because of what you did, because of the position you put them in. And then you have the audacity to turn around and call this voluntary. I mean, and it's just classic. It's just classic. This is the oppressor versus the marginalized, mentality. You put these individuals in this kind of setting, and then you try to pat yourself on the back as the person who's put this oppression upon them. As if it's some sort of square deal.
Voluntary feeding.
Family farm.
Family farm.
So
third generation.
You are third generation.
Mm-hmm.
And all right. So I come back to that. And I mean, and the family farming phrasing is just this it's such a common thing that they go to, and the false dichotomy that they're very deliberately drawing is that there's some distinction. Well, if it's a family farm, it must not be a factory farm. It's absolutely not the case. The vast majority of farms, including quote-unquote family farms, whatever the hell that means, are factory farms. The vast majority of animals are living in factory farm settings. 99% of individuals, the vast majority of them being smaller animals like chickens, are in these kind of settings. And this family farming is just a completely disingenuous dodge of that fact.
You got kids?
Yes, we have 2 daughters.
Are they into it?
Yes, and we have a son that's farming, and we also have our oldest son is a hoof trimmer, does pedicures for cows.
What kind of penalties would you be subjected to if it were discovered that you weren't playing by the rules?
We would be shut off, and
by
that's
whom?
By Dairy Farmers of Ontario. That means the milk truck would not pick up the milk.
All right, and as Camille, as the attorney brought up recently, there's no documentation provided about how often does this actually happen. How often does the dairy, the truck stops supplying them, this sort of a thing, and it's very deliberate. Once again, that those are not released publicly, so you can talk about this wonderful system, but when it's time for records, when it's time for photographs, when it's time for transparency, you got nothing. It's all fluff.
Oh. That's what happens if you're not grade A. So grade A is that you've met all the standards. Your bedding pack is big enough. Your stalls are the right size. You have enough water capacity. You have feeding space for your cows. And your quality issues on your cows. If your cows are living in squalor and being treated the way you talk, you'd have severe quality issues. And in Ontario, we don't have severe quality issues.
So let me ask Camille this then. Camille, if you are unhappy with the current...
And I just want to go back to this too, like quality issues. Like how bad would a cow's well-being have to be before it actually affects the quality of the milk? I mean, an individual can endure so much physical and psychological trauma before it be manifest in some sort of way. Like I'm not I don't even know what that would look like, but you can go through a whole heck of a lot and it wouldn't be visible. I mean, in the flesh, consuming the flesh, or in the milk, it's not going to be like, how would you even be able to tell? Like that would just have to be so horrific. So it's just, again, a complete different universe of standards for what's necessary for profit versus what's necessary for an animal to be actually living a decent life.
Kind of oversight that we have in the province of Ontario, who should be enforcing animal welfare rights?
Well, there should be laws. The government should create laws, and the government should be in charge of enforcing those laws. So this voluntary industry process where the industry comes up with its own codes, in my view, that's something that they've done to avoid being regulated, which is common when industries don't want the government to step in. So I think the government should step in. It should create publicly enacted laws that we, as citizens, can have a say in the creation of. And then, of course, the government should be the one inspecting with regular randomized inspections and inspection reports that are publicly available. That's the only way for the public to have confidence that there is not really untoward things happening.
Transparency.
Super unreasonable. I think what she's saying is just super unreasonable.
I trust the farmers.
I trust the farmers too. They're going to do
Okay, but
job.
even at the end of the day, if you wanted to put the government in charge of this, that means the government has to hire inspectors. And short of the government hiring hundreds, if not thousands of inspectors, they'll probably hire a couple of dozen, just given the nature of what they're able to do. How much of a dent would that actually put in the problem?
Now she's going to actually talk about how it's not as big of an issue as he is, as the host there sets out. But I just want to go, this is really an issue of priority. And this is like the sneaky way in which speciesism really permeates our society, because why is it treated as an impossible problem? Well, it's because you deprioritize non-human lives. It's because you're just saying, well, it's not worth it. What, hundreds of individuals, like, oh my God, like it's just so daunting to think that we would hire 100 people. Well, how many people do we pay to how much money does it cost to care for humans? Like we don't say, oh my God, can you imagine a healthcare system for human beings to make sure humans are taken care of? That's what, millions, billions, might even be hundreds of billions of dollars. We can't take care of humans. We can't make sure humans are well taken care of. That's absurd. And the bottom line is, if we're doing anything, close to objectively caring about kind of the net sum of lives, the net sum of suffering and well-being in this world, these are the terms in which we should be thinking of. And the bottom line is like this whole conversation, our whole society, our culture, our legislation, our politics is just crafted around animals as objects to use and abuse. And it's to the point where, the idea of hiring hundreds of people to ensure the welfare of, millions, billions of individuals would seem so absurd. Like, that's not absurd at all.
It's a very small ask.
Yeah.
Well, the reality is that the public is already paying for the dairy farm's self-assessments. We heavily subsidize the dairy industry in this country. Hundreds of millions of dollars every year go to subsidize dairy farmers and their products. So why don't we redirect those subsidies toward public inspections? It strikes me as ironic that the dairy farmers are happy to benefit from the public purse and from public subsidies, but they don't want public oversight.
Let me just make sure I understand that. When you say public subsidies, you mean supply management?
Supply management, there's constantly grants being given for equipment upgrade, for research, for all kinds of other ways to improve the dairy industry. And that money could be redirected toward oversight.
Bonnie, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, not only have you not been on a farm, I think you need to get educated on the economics of Ontario and Canada dairy industry. We are not subsidized. And we have not been subsidized like forever. Not anything in comparison to the United
No more
States.
than any other business, I guess is what you mean. I mean, you get tax advantages that every other business gets.
Yes,
right.
yes, yeah. But we do not get subsidized. We do not, the industry has invested greatly, but a lot of it has been out of our own pocket.
Well, so maybe we're quibbling over words here. Supply management may not be a subsidy, but it's...
That's a discussion for another day.
And it definitely is a different issue. But
Today we're talking
management.
Today we're talking about rules and regulations. And
okay, so yeah, that was a nice little dodge there. It's like, oh, we don't have things that we technically call subsidies, but as the Camille laid out there, there's grants, there's these other programs that send funds to dairy farmers, and this is the only reason that these industries, that animal agriculture as a whole is viable, is because of how heavily it is supported by the government. I mean, if we had a system which was anywhere near logical from an economic perspective, when you have an industry which is imposing actually all these negative externalities on society, animal welfare, the environment, public health, these are industries which not only should not be being subsidized, well, step one is, should they exist at all? But to the extent that they still exist at all, these are industries which would be prime candidates, like a textbook candidate for a heavy tax. And instead, there's all these different ways in which they're subsidized. And even if it was just zero, your plant-based milks would be so much more economical. You have to feed animals, 10 times as much food to produce, one pound of output, whether it's milk or flesh or whatever. And so, if the underlying system was anywhere near equitable, dairy and all of animal agriculture would just be this extreme luxury good, and it would be very much on its way out.
you want a provincial organization or policing of the dairy farm. They are going to base their authority on the best management practices and the code of practice that the National Farm Animal Council, Care Council has come up with. And that is processors, producers, vets, researchers in the world. Again,
advocating for the industry self-oversight. That's the only option that she's presenting here. She's saying that's all we can possibly do.
Everybody's getting paid.
Animal. Those are all outside. It's all based on science. The inspectors at Dairy Farmers of Ontario, the field service reps, are authorized by the Ontario Farm Products Marketing Commission, which is an arm of the government. And the authority to run Dairy Farmers of Ontario and their field services reps goes back to the government. So it is.
I've got to give Camille a chance to respond to that.
I mean, what Bonnie's describing is a very industry-led and industry-created process. The codes of practice are created largely by the industry. Sure, there's some representation from government, from scientists, but The codes of practice are designed to protect the industry, and they disregard a lot of scientific information. They still allow for horrific practices like separating baby cows from their mothers a moment after birth. And these inspections, or assessments really is a better term for them, again, they're done by the industry. And I just don't have confidence, and I don't believe that the public has confidence that the industry is there to protect the animals. The industry is there to protect its profits.
Okay, let me go back to Twitter here for a second, because Camille, in the midst of the online conversation that you were having with many of our viewers, you had this to say: there's nothing sustainable about animal agriculture, which is a leading cause of climate change. More efficient to feed grain to humans instead of to cows for years before we slaughter and eat them. And this raised, a number of questions on Twitter and, about the fact that you're a vegan, right, Camille?
Animal lawyers don't eat their clients, that's right.
Animal lawyers don't eat their clients, okay.
God, it's just, exploiting individuals, torturing them, killing them needlessly. God, just so, good fellow there.
People, of course, have made the suggestion that that your broader agenda here is, of course, to get us all to be vegans. Is that the case?
Oh, I mean, I don't think that the farming industry is going away tomorrow. So I think that's kind of a distraction from the main point here. The point I wanted to make on Twitter is that people are abandoning meat and dairy products at increasing rates and moving towards alternatives that are better for the environment and often better for human health as well. I think it's really interesting that last week when we had this discussion and the Twitter fight was going on, the Canada Food Guide was revised and released that week, and it actually completely removed the dairy category from the food guide, and it lumped it in with a just a general protein category and said that people should be eating more plant-based proteins instead of the animal proteins that we're used to eating. So there's a move toward doing that for human health. The United Nations has said that 17% or more of global planetary emissions come from the livestock industry, and that we won't meet our climate targets if we continue to raise livestock at these levels. So I think that's one thing that's motivating people to shift away from these products.
Do you, Bonnie, think that the real agenda here is to get everybody off meat and dairy and just turn us all into vegans?
That's another day. We can have that discussion another day. But no,
well, you're here right now. Why don't we talk about it now?
People are not going to move away from that. And 20% of our farmland is not croppable. We pasture our cows on there, and they turn grass into milk like magic. And that's an environmental and efficient use of that land, and that's what our ecosystem is all about. For us to move away from animal agriculture would disturb the whole ecosystem in the countries.
I mean, and so 20% of the land is not croppable, but meanwhile, the vast majority of the actual plants we're growing are growing towards animals. So again, it's just like this little cherry picking of numbers to say, well, there's some land where we're raising a certain amount of animals, which we couldn't raise plants on. And it's just this very convenient little twisted logic. I also want to, refer back to this notion of, these people just want everyone to be vegan, as they say. And it's like, yeah, I think animal personhood makes all the sense in the world, and we should have that conversation. And it's also convenient how this is just kind of like the last desperate, fallback. When you're done having all the actual substantive conversations, and it's like, yeah, your transparency is a joke, the systemic conditions of animals is a joke, like this whole industry is horrible for the environment, everything about it is horrible, oh, whatever, you just want everybody to go vegan. It's just like this sort of just like blanket dismissal, to avoid having an actual conversation.
And before you continue on, I mean, I think it's also interesting how they're profiling both Bonnie and Camille, because Bonnie is just like, well, let me tell me about your farm, tell me about your family, tell me about all of those things you're doing, and then that's like really supported. Mm-hmm. And then this is just like, you're a vegan.
Yeah.
You have a vegan agenda.
Yeah. I didn't even think about that too. Yeah, it'd be like, Tell us about like your upbringing. Like you tell us about when you've hung out at a farm animal sanctuary and you made friends with a pig. Like that would be the balanced approach. But it's like, this tenacious young woman against nice Grandma Bonnie. Come on, leave Bonnie alone.
So that's an argument for another day, but we could spend all day on that one.
Well, let's try this. One more tweet here from somebody named Paula, who goes by the Twitter handle Dairy Farm Her, replying to Camille and others. she tweeted, "Don't forget that I'm a mom too, that cares about the environment. It's also one of our top priorities on our farm. In fact, our carbon footprint, water consumption, and land use associated with the production of a liter of milk have decreased significantly between 2011 and 2016. Camille, is that constructive?
Well,
So again, like this is like a very convenient, positive little framing for the industry. So they don't say what their net numbers are. They don't say what the actual environmental impact they currently have are. It's just like it's better than it used to be. Like it used to be super duper horrible, and now it's like 25% less horrible. It's just like so like there's just like
There's no
layers
scale.
of PR.
There's no scale at all in terms of the layers, or in terms of like what effect it has on the environment. So it's just a very convenient fact.
I still think that milk is far more water intensive and far more greenhouse gas producing than the alternatives. So milk producing cow's milk takes about 6 times as much water as producing a cup of almond milk, and about 3 times as much water as producing a cup of soy milk. So you can't really compare those on the environmental scale. Plant milks are just clearly better on the environmental front.
Bonnie, clearly Paula believes that the changes that she has made in her situation have been a constructive contribution to reducing climate change. How reflective of the entire province is her situation?
Oh yes, for sure. Our greenhouse emissions have reduced significantly and will continue to. We have 3 barns on our farm. We have the barn that's 150 years old. And if you want to talk about animal cruelty, go back to 150 years when barns were crammed full and the ceiling was 8 feet high and there was no lighting and no windows and no ventilation system. 40 years ago, my husband and I built a new barn, and it had fluorescent lighting. It had a ventilation system. It had a manure system in it. The cows were really comfortable, and we were like top of the world. Last fall, our daughter built a new barn, and it's a voluntary milking barn. It's like 5 times as big as our old barn for the same amount of cows. And the atmosphere in there, and
like a party.
and the energy efficiency of it, and the water efficiency of washing the systems and everything has come so far. I
got 20 seconds. Forgive me for jumping in. I got 20 seconds left here. I don't mean to make too much mischief here. Maybe a little bit of mischief. Why don't you invite her to your farm?
I'd love to. We have a day on the farm in June, on Father's Day weekend on the Saturday. It's called Sheldon Creek Dairy. We also bottle our own milk on the farm. And I would love to give you a personal tour around the farm.
Camille, Bonnie is extending an invitation. You want to take her up on it?
Happily, Bonnie, and I hope you'll get your large mass chicken farmer producer friends to let me into their barns too, but I'm doubtful.
Okay. You know what? We'll take that little moment of consensus we had there and we'll run with it. And let's see what kind of feedback we get to this program. Camille Labchuk from Animal Justice. She's a lawyer as well. We thank you for being there on the line for us in the nation's capital. Bonnie Den Haan from Handview Farms, also with the Dairy Farmers of Ontario. We really appreciate you making the long trek into our studio tonight as well.
I didn't even miss that part.
Yeah. So I don't know, thoughts?
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered.
I mean, it's just you kind of like keep bouncing from one thing to the next, and it's really hard to just like really kind of like nail it down to be, at the end there you saw like they're talking about the environmental stuff, be like, I think that's better, but we've gotten better too. All right, let's talk about the ventilation. Like what? I don't even know where that came from. Like clear out of left field. I just like think a whole framing of this conversation from the host and obviously from the dairy farmer. You just start the conversation from a place of like animals are objects. We have to use animals. Like it's just there's no other way but to use animals. So maybe we can talk about like certain ways that it can be tweaked, but like maybe make it a little better for the environment. I love how she like made this notion that, farming has become so much more humane than it was 150 years ago. Like, again, and she just refers to like her one little instance, her one little dairy farm where she says they've made these improvements, which I believe her that they're, when she talks about those things. But I mean, as a whole, farmers used to be this large percentage of North America. That's how people made their living. And now it's 2%. So there's just far more animals in a far smaller space. Factory farming is just exploded over the past 150 years. So it's just, and so much of what she has to say is just like, well, here's me and here's my little situation, and again, just like generalizing it to the whole of animal agriculture in a really dishonest way.
And I think, like something that you brought up, which I don't think people think about, is just like the efficiencies that they try to bring into the system. So when they do go to schools of agriculture, and then they're really looking to, they're looking at the whole like end-to-end process of the animal's life. They're looking just for very specific factors of like, how many days does it take for like a chicken to lay an egg, and like how do we like maximize that egg production, or whatever parameter that they're trying to optimize. They're trying to optimize it. They're trying to like scale up these processes that they then can increase production and then increase cost. And that's just like something that's what the science is. That's not, like, that's really just industrialization. It's not.
Well, and then I think that, it's important to think about like how like these environmental or animal welfare, like the regulations that actually come into place, the whole conversation that happens behind the scenes before those things happen, it's like, okay, so what's an economically viable thing that we can improve, it's not going to increase our cost too much, and that the associated, the PR goodwill is going to kind of make up for it, and then it's going to keep the industry viable. So you look at something like the shift from from battery cages to cage-free eggs. So you see the same amount of chickens in the same amount of space. It does increase their cost a bit, but these industries can charge a premium and actually become more profitable. And it's this really dangerous dynamic whereby in America and in most of the first world, you see meat consumption is actually on the rise, and it's because not because of the conventional, marketed in a conventional way that it clearly comes from a factory farm meat or animal products are being consumed in greater numbers. They're actually on a slight decline, but there's been an explosion of these the humane, the animal welfare marketing and the associated products have really taken off. And it's something we really need to confront head on because people see all these vegan products coming up. There's vegan celebrities, there's certain welfare, and we feel like we're moving in the right direction. But the number of animals being killed is very much on the increase. And even on a per capita basis, the amount of animal products being consumed per individual is on the increase. And I think that's really why these kind of exposés, this kind of coverage, these kind of conversations, the investigations from groups like DXE, independent media getting the message out there is so important, because when you have a system in the U.S., in Canada, elsewhere, where it's fundamentally broken, where you have a government which is reinforcing and rather than regulating industry abuses, it's up to ordinary people to take action, to spread awareness, and to hold our elected officials accountable to the will of the people. All right, any last thoughts?
I just can't believe the ridiculousness of how the conversation here is on mainstream media, and so we really need to change that conversation.
Absolutely. So if you're watching this on Facebook, please check us out on our YouTube channel. That's where exclusive and daily content is posted. You can find that real easily if you just type in dxe.io/SBR for Soy Boy Report. That's dxe.io/SBR. If you're watching on YouTube, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button as well as the notification bell, because when you hit the subscribe button, you're not going to get notified of all our new content. So if you want to see everything, make sure you do both of those things, and we will see you next time.